In this video, I'll share the process that I used to create this entire page of mushroom paintings using gouache. I've done a few of these study pages recently, so I look forward to sharing what I've learned and just chat about gouache painting for a bit. If you would like to paint along, I'll put links to the reference pictures that I'm using below in the description. So thank you to these photographers on Unsplash for sharing your beautiful photos. I'll be using colors from the Holbein Gouache Autumn Iridori paint set, which I recently reviewed, so if you'd like to see that video, I'll link it below. I've added two colors to my palette which were not included in that set, white and Edo Violet. I like to share what colors I'm using because I do get questions about that, but don't feel like you have to use these colors. If you want to paint along, you can use whatever paints you have on hand. Here's a quick look at my sketches so you can see about how detailed they are. It's pretty much just basic shapes, but I do think it's useful to have something of a guide when you start painting. I want to start out with a warm purple for that top left mushroom, so I'm adding in a little bit of red to the violet. If you're ever unsure of your color mix, don't be afraid to try it out on a scrap sheet of paper or make some little swatches next to your painting. This first mushroom has a very cool look to it. It's very shiny and reflective, so I'm painting with a zigzag pattern and leaving white space in between my brush strokes to create high contrast highlights. This is a popular watercolor technique to reserve the highlights by leaving white space, but we also have the option to do that using gouache, in addition to opaque layering. So there are lots of possibilities and different reasons why you might choose one technique over the other, so I'll talk a little bit about my decision making as I go through the process here. So you've seen that I'm using some watercolor techniques, I'm using a good amount of water in my paint mixture, and this is how I normally start off a gouache painting these days. My tastes have changed over time. When I first started painting with gouache, I used a very dry mixture, but these days I love painting with a more watercolor style, at least in the early stages of the painting. And as I layer, the paint will get more thick and opaque. This is a pretty popular way to work with gouache. It's known as thin to thick layering. There are a lot of benefits to working this way, but as you can see here, one nice thing about it is you can create these really smooth gradients and transitions between colors and values. And I absolutely love working with gradients. Gradients are everywhere. Almost everything that you paint has some kind of gradient to it. I think things are rarely ever one pure flat color. Here, for example, even with dirt, just being able to shift slightly between the hues. Here we have a brown and a little bit of indigo, letting them blend together. I feel like it's just such a nice natural look to have these different shades with a soft transition between them. And using more water, letting the paint flow together naturally, just kind of helps do the job for you. And it's also beautiful to watch. I enjoy the process of working this way. It's so pretty. In the case of these mushrooms, it also was helpful because the way the photographs were taken, the mushrooms were in focus and then the background was more blurry. So using this technique to make soft gradients and transitions in the background makes it feel like that depth of field camera blur kind of effect and helps create distance between the mushroom and the background. Now I am going to layer some more details back there, so it'll come into focus a little bit, but that is up to us as we're painting to decide how we want that to look and how in focus we want the background to be. But you can use this for whatever subject you're painting. If you want your background to feel out of focus a little bit, then allow things to get blurry. I think it's a lot of fun. It can also introduce happy accidents into your work. Sometimes you have a little bit too much water or things just happen that you don't expect and you can get some interesting textures. Sometimes it doesn't work the way you like, but it's all about learning, and the more that you paint, then the more you can sort of predict what's going to happen and get a handle on things that way. When you use a lot of water in your paint mix, it often helps to tilt your canvas, so to put something behind it or use an easel so that the paint will flow downward in a more predictable manner. As you can see here, I don't always bother with that, and sometimes I don't mind if the paint flows upward a little bit, so it's okay, and I'll leave the paper flat. One thing that I found fun about this subject was that there's a lot of dirt involved. They're mostly coming out of the earth or on a tree or something like that. So it feels like it invites looseness and messiness a little bit. So I felt less the need to make everything perfect and strict. This is something that's always fun with painting organic subjects, but I felt like was extra true with painting mushrooms. What I've been doing with these mushroom pages is similar to what I did with the rock painting study page, if you've seen that video. I'll link that one below for anyone interested, but basically I'm going to complete the first layer of paint on this mushroom and then move on to the next mushroom and paint the first layer and then the next, and then come back for layer 2 once they've all had the first layer completed. This will give time for the layers to dry while I move on, and it also gives me a little break from the thing I'm working on so I can come back later with fresh eyes. I find this way of working to be a lot of fun, and there's something about the pace of it that keeps me motivated. The second mushroom is very light. It's mostly white or an off-white color, and that's a good opportunity for us to play around with color temperatures to make things more interesting. So on the left side of the mushroom, where there's a bit of a shadow, we can push that a little bit more towards blue or a cool tone. And then on the right side, where the sunlight is hitting, a warm color will help give that impression of warm light. With any study or painting, it helps to ask yourself, what is my main point, or what is my main goal here? What do I want to get across? And it does not have to be some big elaborate message. Most of my work is about nature, showcasing the beauty of nature, trying to share things that interest me and what I find beautiful. So for example, in the case of this mushroom and the lovely reference photo, what stood out to me was the feeling and the mood that I got from the warm sunlight playing against the cool colored sky in the background. You can really feel the crisp autumn air. And so it can be as simple as that. So I wanted to capture the same feeling in my painting, maybe even exaggerate it if possible. And I really wanted to focus on the play of cool and warm colors. So that helps to give a goal and a direction and something to keep thinking about and pushing towards in my mind as I work. For this one, I got a little experimental with the background. I wanted the looseness and softness, but I had colors that I didn't want to fully blend together with the orange and the blue. So I left some white spaces here and there to prevent the full blending of those colors and have some soft edges and some hard edges. And there was maybe a little more blending than I expected, but overall I think it worked out okay. Okay, so check this out. Here's an example of what can happen with this kind of wet painting on a flat surface. See how the brown is getting pulled upward or flowing upward into the wet paint? Sometimes this kind of effect can be great. It kind of looks like some little plants or twigs sprouting up, so I don't mind it at all, but I am gonna grab my sketchbook and tilt it because I don't want it going up any further. And I'm gonna add some more twiggy plants coming up in the background behind the mushroom. And I was careful not to have my brush loaded up with too much paint, or I would have ended up depositing too much into this wet area and we would have had like a lot of blooms or just like paint overflow back there. So if you are having problems with that, pay extra attention to how much water and how much paint is loaded on your brush when you're doing wet and wet painting, especially when you're adding that second layer into the already wet area. It can be a bit tricky to get the hang of it, and I still misjudge things sometimes, but that's why I like doing these study pages, because they give me a place to play and test things where I feel a little bit more free. I find that when I'm working on paintings that I really care about, whether it's personal work or client work, I find it hard to let myself go and experiment there because I just want to make sure that the painting has a good result. So it's important, I think, as an artist to have a place where you can play and be free and make mistakes. And if the results don't turn out how you expect, or if they don't turn out good, it just doesn't matter. One thing I've been having fun playing with on these pages is the edges of each little illustration. So here you can see I'm using some dry brushing for the texture of the bark and just playing around with seeing how far to take that, different amounts of paint, different amounts of dryness, and what does that look like, and just kind of letting it fade out at the edge. Usually with my paintings, I use tape around the outside so I can peel that off at the end and have the nice clean edges. And I mean, it's always fun to peel the tape, of course, but aside from that, I also like how it looks. It's very neat and tidy, and I feel like it's a professional finish to the painting. But I'm starting to really enjoy these organic edges, and I'm curious about maybe trying them in some of my larger works, and not just in the sketchbook. But I don't know, maybe I have to work up my bravery a little bit more for that one. Let me know what you guys think. Do you tape off your paintings or do you leave a natural edge? Maybe it depends on the situation, because I think that's kind of where I am with it, but I'm curious what you guys think. And should I try to do a larger scale painting with the natural edges? So getting back to the painting, I'm starting with this curled leaf that's kind of in the foreground next to the mushroom. And I think I'm going to paint this a little bit more in focus. Anything that's close up to the mushroom, I want to bring into focus a little bit more. So that's going to happen with the coming layers. But even in this first base layer, you can see that the area on the ground next to the mushroom, I'm kind of trying to paint it in a little bit more detail and maybe a little bit less loose than the background. I also just thought that leaf was a really cool part of the scene. I love painting leaves, and this one kind of curled into this really neat position, the way the light was hitting it and the way that the center line on the leaf was kind of pointing at the mushroom. I think that's a really nice compositional element to have those leading lines pointing inward towards the focal area. So that's definitely something that I wanted to make sure I captured in my version. Next, I'm bringing in some darker browns for the dirt and the shadows underneath the leaves. I find this really satisfying for some reason. It just feels good to see the white space disappear finally and to bring in some darker values, because suddenly we get a much better feeling for the lighting in the scene, and it makes things feel more realistic. I feel like it gives a boost of motivation when you can start to see things coming together. The last thing that I want to do on this mushroom during this first pass through is the shadow under the cap. After that, I think we've pretty much gotten rid of all the white space, and there's at least a base layer on everything in the scene. I've chosen a warm color for the shadow because there's a lot of bounce light off the ground and the warm colored leaves that are affecting that shadow color. And again, I do want to push the warm, cool feeling in the scene, so we can maybe push that a little further than it even is in the reference picture and hopefully exaggerate the mood even more. While this is wet, I'm adding in a little bit of a darker brown and letting it flow down to make a nice transition in the shadow, a little soft blend there. So sneaking in one last gradient before we move on to the next mushroom. So for the next mushroom, I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach, and I'm going to be doing something called negative painting. So I'll be painting the background first, and the mushroom shape will appear in the middle. This is something that I've done on the other pages as well, kind of experimenting with negative painting versus regular painting, and I found that especially for the very light colored mushrooms, the white or almost white ones, I found that the negative painting worked very well and felt like a comfortable way to work. I think that when you're beginning to paint a very light colored object on white paper, it can be kind of difficult to know as you paint the object if what you're doing is too light or too dark, because without any environment, it's just hard to get a feel for what the colors and values need to be. I guess that can be true with any object, but I think especially for the very, very light colored objects, everything is just so subtle that it feels tricky. So with painting the background first, you set the stage, you know what the lighting and the colors of the environment are, and your white mushroom just kind of appears naturally in the center, and then you can start to paint in, the colors and shadows and textures and details and all of that. But you already have a lot around you to work with to let you know the amount of shadow, the lights and darks and bounce light and stuff like that. So I would definitely suggest experimenting with this and try doing it both ways and see what you like. I don't think there's a right or wrong with this. It's just fun and useful to have different options available. What I like about doing this kind of painting in gouache is also that it feels pretty relaxed because we can paint light colors over dark colors as well. So if I make a rogue brushstroke and accidentally paint over too much of the mushroom in the center, that's fine because we can come back in later, do some opaque layering, some white gouache, and paint the mushroom back in. So I'm being careful to not paint in the mushroom area, but if anything messy happens, it's no big deal. Now, you may be wondering, speaking of opaque painting, why not just paint the entire background, and don't worry about leaving a space for the mushroom? Why not paint the entire background and then use white gouache layer on top and paint the mushroom in that way? Well, there's nothing wrong with that. You can absolutely do that as a workflow. The reason that I chose not to work that way is because I want the option to be able to paint with certain techniques when I paint the mushroom. So for example, as I've been talking about, I really enjoy the soft watercolor-like blends when you use more water and use these wet and wet techniques. If I had painted the full background, then layered a thick white layer of paint to paint the mushroom back in, and then tried to do these kind of techniques on top of that, probably wouldn't work, and I'd be really struggling with reactivating paint in the layers below. So that is why I decided to reserve the clean white paper for the mushroom shape in the middle so that I can do these kind of gradients. And again, I'm trying to play with the cool and warm colors and the shadows, just like with the top right mushroom that we just did. I also like to paint the dirt around the base of the mushroom while the mushroom shape is just a little bit wet so you get a soft transition. The cap of this mushroom is a little bit similar to the first mushroom that we did in the sense that it's a brightly colored cap with some white details on it. But I'm going to take a different approach than I did with the first one, and there is a reason why. Do you see how many little white dots are on that mushroom? With the first mushroom, it didn't take too much effort to leave some open spaces. I made some horizontal brush strokes and the highlights just naturally appeared. But for this one, other than a couple little natural openings that happened, it would have taken a lot of work to paint around all of those little tiny details. So in the end, I opted for this approach, which was to paint the red color in first, and then in the next layer, once everything's dry, we will opaquely layer in the white details on top. I just wanted to mention this because I think it's a good example of how you can choose between different workflows and different techniques using gouache, depending on the situation. And as you're painting, you're always going to be assessing throughout the process which option is better for that particular thing that you're working on. For the next study, we have a couple of mushroom friends, and they have such a cool texture on the top of them that I'm looking forward to painting, but we have to lay the groundwork first. I'm starting off the base of the cap with pale yellows and blues, just like with the top right mushroom, and this will hopefully give a feeling of the atmosphere of the scene, the cool and warm light that's bouncing around. Aside from the texture of these mushrooms, that atmosphere is what I really liked about the image and what got me interested in painting it. So in the photo, the light's hitting on the ground on the top right, and it's warmer over there, and then cooler on the bottom left. And it's cool that you can see that reflected on the mushrooms. These mushrooms have a lot of detail to them, so I'm thinking about that as I paint, and I'm beginning to drop in this pale pinkish brown color and starting to build up that texture. Because things are wet, the paint I'm dropping in is spreading out a little bit, creating soft edges, so as I dot it in, it's creating kind of a mottled look. And you can also see variation in the browns. There's a pinkish brown. Now I'm adding a little bit more of a yellow brown. The reference picture is giving me a lot of information. And then I'm also picking and choosing what I like from that to exaggerate. And if there's anything that I don't like, I can leave that out. So that's often what I'm doing these days with studies. I don't necessarily try to copy every little thing exactly, but I use it as a way to learn. Especially for the things that I like. What is making that work? What is making it look that way and feel that way? And how can I capture that and exaggerate it, if anything? And over time, my interests have changed and evolved, and I think that's going to be true for every artist. At different times, different things have been more interesting and more inspiring to me. But right now, I would say color, light, and mood, those things feel very connected. It feels like if you want to capture mood and atmosphere, then color and light are very, very important. So speaking of light, you can see I've begun on the top right where the sunlight is hitting. I wet that area first with clean water and began dropping in some warm yellow, gold, green, browns, and letting everything softly mingle together. As with the other mushrooms, I want that distant look to the background, so I'm creating soft edges. I found this to be maybe the trickiest out of all of them, just the area around the mushrooms. And I'm not sure exactly why, but I think it has to do with the colors. You can see I'm shifting here into some cooler colors that were in the surrounding foliage. And I think that between the warm and cool colors, softly blending together, I think I ended up with some muddy colors in the transitions. But we are painting mud. I mean, this is a painting of literally dirt and mud behind mushrooms, so I'm telling myself it's okay that the colors are getting a little bit muddy. If you're painting actual mud, Are muddy colors okay? Let me know in the comments. I hope so. Anyway, we're gonna be doing more layers on this. We're gonna be adding grasses and it'll all work out. So I'm just continuing on. My main goal at this point is to make sure that values are working, because I see a potential issue in that the stem of the mushroom and the rim of the cap are kind of close in value to the mud and the dirt. So in order to make sure that the mushrooms pop, I want to create contrast in value. So I've darkened the dirt at the base of the mushrooms so that those stems really pop out. Now the stems are much lighter than the dirt, so there's no issue there. And then right under the caps, I'm bringing some of that warm color from the top right of the scene down and under. So in that case, we've created contrast in sort of the opposite way. The background is now lighter, or at least lighter than the dark rim around the bottom of the mushroom cap. So in both cases, we have a more dramatic contrast now between the mushroom and the surrounding colors. This one definitely challenged me between the colors and the value corrections I had to make, but in the end I think it's going okay, and we will come back to this one for a second layer once it's dry to add some grasses and final details to the mushrooms. The next one we're going to be doing is probably my favorite out of all of the mushrooms, so I guess I saved the best for last here. I don't know what it is about these two, but they are so cute. It reminds me of like a little mom and baby mushroom or something. I think it's just their rounded shapes and the size difference between them. It's very cute. So anyway, getting into the painting, I'm starting off much like with the others, letting colors blend together. I love these golden brown mushroom caps. When you look at the reference photo, you can see a lot of subtle little differences with browns and golds and just these differences in the hue. So compared to some of the other mushrooms, I was going back to my palette a lot more often here to get like a slightly different color and taking it a little bit more slowly here. I think it was worth it. I'm really enjoying the textures and the color variation and how this turned out. One of my favorite parts was adding this tiny bit of cool bounce light on top of the mushroom cap. So basically the upward facing area on the top of the mushroom had some cool bounce light from the sky. So I began with a little bit of a darker base and then painted on top of that. I dropped in some bluish gray with a hint of purple. I had to test that color a couple times to get the right shade, but I think once that was in, it really started to feel more three-dimensional. I also like the effect of the complementary color, that little bit of cool blue on top of the like gold and warm browns. And the rest of the mushroom has a lot of opportunity for that kind of color and light play as well. So I'm starting out painting in a base color with a semi-transparent mix, sort of a warm beige color, and we can drop all kinds of other hues into this. And I just love watching this. It's very satisfying. And for organic subjects, just kind of letting things blend together, seeing what happens. You can kind of push the paint around if you want, but a lot of times it just does some cool stuff all on its own. There are a couple places that I know I want to be darker, like right under the mushroom cap or where the mushrooms are touching each other. So I'm adding a little bit more shadow there. And on the right side of the mushroom, there's going to be a little bit more of that blue bounce light, and also some green bounce light from the grass and moss that is surrounding the mushroom. It's kind of subtle, but I think it adds something, and as we begin adding the moss in, it's hopefully going to make the mushrooms feel more like they belong in that environment because you can see it reflected on them. I enjoyed painting the moss because it was fun to see the mushrooms suddenly pop out once they had that darker background. I did want to differentiate between the foreground moss and the background behind the mushrooms, so I tried to do that by varying the green colors. I went with a bright springy green for close up in the foreground, and for the background I tried creating that blurred effect again, mostly with cooler greens and teals, and also with some bright spots mixed in. I kind of wanted it to feel like there was something going on back there, like a blurry forest scene with light coming through the foliage. If you're following along with the reference photos, you may have noticed that some shadows are missing. There will eventually be some sharper looking cast shadows on the mushrooms, as this lighting situation is causing the cap of the mushroom to cast a pretty dramatic shadow on the body. So I almost started painting those at one point before going on to the background, but I decided to hold off because I want to make sure that the mushroom was completely dry, the white part of the mushroom, before painting that shadow. It's really important that we have the nice hard edges on it, so we'll be safe and come back and paint that in the second layer when everything is perfectly dry. So layer 1 on all the mushrooms is now complete. They all have a base layer, which is doing most of the heavy lifting, as you can see. But now we get to go back in and do details. And I find this part to be a lot of fun as you see things come together. Like these leaves, just adding a little bit of lines here and there to show veins of the leaves suddenly takes an abstract shape and makes it look like something. So, adding some sticks and twigs coming out of the dirt, little leaves here and there, textures, and just bringing things into focus. I'm mostly detailing in the foreground and on the mushrooms themselves, and for the distant background, I'm going to try to leave it more blurry. So you can decide how far back into the distance that you want your detailing to go, and that's going to affect how it looks as far as your focus. And this layer isn't only about details, it's also about building things up to where they need to be value-wise. So here I'm adding some texture, like this little ribbing kind of effect under the mushroom cap, but it's also getting darker at the same time. So I'm adding texture, but I'm also trying to work on the values and get them closer to where they need to be, and figure out how dark the shadows need to be. And so it takes a little bit of time, and there normally is some back and forth while figuring things out. On this page, things went pretty well for me, but there are some times where I'll decide I need to make a big correction to something, and I'll actually remove paint, re-wet an area and use a paper towel to pull some paint up and things like that. Of course, you can also paint over to correct things. But the point is, if things are not quite right, don't worry. It's all part of the process, and part of the fun challenge in painting is figuring out those puzzles of how to improve things and how to get the results that you want. So this second layer or second step is nearly finished, and then we will move on to the next mushroom. There will be one last pass over all of them at the very end where I'll just put some final highlights and details and check to see if everything's okay before calling it finished. So this is somewhat of a 3-step process, but really most of the painting is taking place in these first 2 steps. Moving over to the top right mushroom, I wanted to darken some areas in the background. It felt like once everything dried, it just wasn't quite dark enough, so this is going to help the mushroom pop out from the background. I also wanted to darken the area of tree bark and on the ground, but I did like how there were all these different colors, the greens and the warm browns and the cool browns. So as I'm adding the next layer and darkening things, I'm still trying to bring in those different color variations to the new layer so I don't lose that effect, but hopefully still manage to darken it a bit. Finally, it's time to put some detail on the actual mushroom, and I had to kind of experiment here with how to indicate the texture. This mushroom had some really cool and interesting texture to it, but it kind of looked like little bits of the outer layer of like the skin were peeling up a little bit. It created almost like a fuzzy or furry look, so I started first with putting some browns or darker colors to look like the little shadows from those bits that were peeling up. And I'm also working on a cast shadow at the top of the mushroom and kind of going back and forth. I'm gonna add some lighter details too. Like here you can see I'm adding some pieces on the end, that outer rim, that are curling or peeling up. And by painting these lighter details against the darker bark behind it, you can really see that texture because of the high contrast. So that area I think helped a lot. And I'm just kind of layering the shadows and continuing on until it finally feels like it's getting this fuzzy texture. And overall, I'm happy with how it's going, but I will say it was a bit labor intensive with the layering, and I wish I could have maybe thought of another way or found another way to indicate that texture without painting all the little details. That is a big challenge, and one of my favorite puzzles in painting is trying to figure out how to create the illusion of detail and texture in different ways, rather than actually painting everything super precisely. Like with the dry brushing on that tree bark in the back, that seemed like a good way to get more detailed texture without too much effort. Sometimes you just feel it, you just see the opportunity for where to do that, but that wasn't really the case with the mushroom, so I ended up just taking my number 2 round brush and painting all the little details until it looked right. And I think that worked out. And maybe it was the best option because that is the focal area, that is the focal point. So it makes sense that it's going to be more tightly rendered. So what I did in this case to try to keep things looking fresh is to make sure that at least around the outside edges of the composition that I let things be a little bit more loose. So you can see, the dry brushing of the tree, and then at the bottom, I kind of just let things fade out naturally where the brush strokes ended if it was uneven, and then with the grasses, kind of letting those grow out of the composition too. So my hope was that it still feels a little loose, even though I got kind of picky there with the texture on the mushroom. Okay, so we're coming up to one of my favorite parts of painting this entire page, and that is the shadows on these little mushrooms. I've been eyeing this shadow since I first looked at the photo, and I finally get to paint it. What I'm trying to do is create a gradient, so instead of just using gray for the shadow, I want to really accentuate the colors that I'm seeing in the photo. There's a little bit of a warm yellow greenish glow inside of that shadow, and there's a little bit of blue on the right side too, which I want to hint at. And one thing that's so much fun about this shape is that it starts off with this really hard edge at the top. As it kind of wraps around the side of the mushroom, it gets all these organic edges and things, and it kind of breaks up because of the texture of the mushroom. So you've got this clean edge shadow that feeds into these organic shapes and creates all these little edges where you can really show off the texture of this mushroom. And it's a subtle texture, but there's still a lot going on. There's this ribbing kind of effect, and yeah, I really enjoyed painting that and getting the blues and yellows and greens inside those shadows. The image feels a lot more three-dimensional with those cast shadows in place. Next, I'm moving on to the cap of the mushroom because we also have some texture there, and it is kind of a similar ribbing, sort of wrinkled texture. So I'm just following the reference and painting it in, trying to imitate what I see there. I'm using a pretty transparent mix here, which you can probably see. It's more of a watercolor approach that I've taken on this mushroom for the most part. Now that I'm getting later in the process, you will see some more opaque painting, like here with the moss, these little tiny tufts of moss. I have a little bit more of an opaque mixture here, and you can see it especially here while I'm using a lighter green to paint over the darker greens. I'm getting a little more detailed with the foliage that's right next to the mushroom because that would also be more in focus. And I'm going to leave that background pretty soft. So the foreground's getting texture, mushroom itself is getting texture, and then on the top of the mushroom there are these, actually I don't even know what these are. I don't know if these are part of the mushroom or if they're little flecks of dirt that landed on the mushroom, but they look like little sprinkles on top, and I painted them in opaquely and then added a tiny little shadows to them so that they would, stand out and look three-dimensional. I'm also using the opaque white to add a little bit of highlight and accentuate that very textured area near the shadow. There are just a couple more mushrooms left that need their second layer, so let's move on to the one in the middle. I'm starting off with adding the lines underneath the cap for that filter area, and I've decided to paint the underside of the mushroom a little bit lighter than it appears in the photo. I'm also exaggerating the orange glow a little bit just because I think it looks nice and I want things to feel light and airy. One thing that I liked about this mushroom was the look of the stem and the transition from this super smooth texture at the top into more of a rough pattern at the bottom of the stem below that little skirt. And the contrast was interesting, so I wanted to make sure I paid some attention to it as I was rendering. As I painted the shadows at the bottom, I used little brush strokes that were like sharp little dashes to try to get that kind of texture. I used a light blue grayish color on the left and a warmer brown on the right. I noticed in the reference photo that there was that little bit of color temperature difference there, and as I'm sure you've noticed throughout this video, I like to exaggerate that whenever possible, so I tried to do that here as well. And I think it makes things feel more three-dimensional because if one type of lighting is reflecting off of an object on one side and another type of lighting is reflecting off the object on the other side, it gives our brain evidence that this thing is existing in 3D space and being affected by its surroundings. So paying attention to bounce light really helps to make things feel more dynamic and less flat. I also spent a little time here adding some extra foliage and details to the moss. With the previous layer, everything was painted very wet, so there are a lot of soft edges, and now I'm just coming in with a fresh layer of paint, so you can see I'm getting hard edges and I can get more precise details. So this will bring things into focus more at the base of the mushroom. Finally, it's time to add the cherry on top of this mushroom, which are these tiny little sprinkles that just make it feel like something out of a fairy tale. I started off with a little bit of a darker off-white color just to place them, and then followed up with a bright white for the highlight. I think that having shadow on these little guys helps to give them some dimension, and I think that's part of the charm about them is that they look so chunky, so I think having that shadow helps a lot. After adding those details, I suddenly felt like the underneath of the mushroom cap didn't feel polished enough anymore. Compared to the top, it felt unfinished. So I went in and added a little bit more definition to what was going on under there. I added some shadows, some highlights. I tried to define the ribbing underneath the cap a little bit more using light because, like I said, I wanted things to feel airy there, so I was trying to be careful not to add too much shadow as I continued to define things. And at one point, I just felt like I ended up with muddy or dirty looking colors under the cap, so I tried to solve that by bringing in this pinkish brown color instead of the gray that had been there. So I decided to warm up the temperature of the deepest part of the shadow in hopes that it would feel better and less muddy. I think out of all of the mushrooms, that area on this particular one gave me the most trouble. I just felt very undecided on that part of it. I couldn't quite figure out what to do. I do think I like it better with the warmer color, even if maybe it's not the most realistic. The mushroom has kind of a fantasy feeling to it anyway, so I think it works, but sometimes you just gotta move on. I didn't want to get stuck here repainting that part over and over, so we are going to call it here and move on to the next one. So for these two, I'm going to jump right into the details on the mushroom cap. There was this cool little almost frilly effect around the outside edge, then darker details on the top and on the stem. I wanted to increase the contrast there. I remember after finishing the first layer on these two, I wasn't quite sure of myself, especially with the background. There was that muddiness issue I was trying to work through. So it's interesting that once I took a break from it and came back, it really didn't feel so bad. It's a very nice benefit of working around the page like this. Even though I didn't actually take a break from painting, I still got a mental break from this particular little illustration and all the challenges of it, and coming back to it again with a fresh perspective made it easier for me to see what needed to be done. Also, some little things that were bothering me before, I just don't even notice anymore, so I guess they weren't that important after all. Another thing I've noticed about taking breaks is it lets me feel less attached to what I've painted and more willing to experiment or toss out some ideas and try something new. When I've just painted something, especially if I've been really struggling and putting a lot of effort into an area, it's like I feel more close to that effort that I've just put into it, and taking a break helps to separate me from that so I don't feel so protective over the work that I've done. Now, everyone's different, so I'm curious if you guys feel the same. I only took a little break from the previous layer, but even so, I was feeling more adventurous when I came back. I re-wet large areas on the bottom, as you just saw, and I've been painting the loose grasses over top of that. And I think it's turning out kind of cool. A bit messy, but that organic quality was what I was hoping for, and I felt like I was able to loosen up and work towards that better in the second layer. My goal now is to sharpen and detail the focal points, like the top of the mushroom cap. I also want to add in some more grasses that will be crisp and in focus. So I'm adding an extra layer of detail on them by adding a light reflecting off, especially on the curved areas. I really want the feeling of lots of grasses overlapping each other, so I'm trying the technique of painting in the shadows in between the grasses to add more depth and make it feel busy and full. So this just about wraps up my second pass through on all of the mushrooms, and I'm just gonna make one last trip around the page and just look for anything that calls out to me. Is there anything looking off or anything I need to add, any last details? Usually it's highlights, if anything, at this stage, and that's what I'm doing here. Just adding some light catching on the outer edge of that little filter part of the mushroom and getting those details in. I also felt the need to add just a little more detail to the base of the mushroom. There were some twigs and these tiny little leaves that I thought added a nice texture and a little bit of interest. So that's pretty much it for this mushroom here, and we're gonna add just some final details to one more of them on the top right here. As I went around the page, these were the only two that really called out to me that they needed something. So I'm adding some last highlights here on this leaf, and also in the surrounding environment, a couple more highlights on the grasses and things. I also snuck in a couple more scribbly grasses around the edge of the composition. I really like the natural edges. I tried to embrace it with these little paintings. Some of them turned out more interesting than others, but overall it was a lot of fun to do. And with these final details, our mushroom painting page is complete. I really hope that you enjoyed joining me for this process. It was not exactly a step-by-step, but I hope that it was helpful and maybe gave you some insights into my workflow and how I make certain decisions. If there's anything that you'd like to hear more about, please let me know in the comments. I will be making more videos, and I'm actually working on a gouache painting course as well. So for those of you who are interested in that, I'm interested to know what you want to know about. So please tell me in the comments, and subscribe if you want to see more videos and be updated about what's going on here. I just want to say a big thank you to all of you who have been watching my videos and leaving supportive comments. It really means a lot. And also, thanks to those of you who encouraged me to make this video. I had shared these other mushroom pages I did on my socials, and there were a lot of questions about the process, so that's why I decided to make this video so you could see how I went about it. Thank you again so much for your support. I hope that you'll do some mushroom painting of your own and have a wonderful time. It's a super fun subject, so take care of yourselves, happy painting, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!